Well, NATO is strengthening its military presence in Eastern Europe amid growing tensions over Ukraine. Now, Canada says it has sent F-18 fighter jets to Romania. According to the Canadian Defense Minister, the mission is part of NATO's measures to, quote, promote security and stability in Eastern and Central Europe. Denmark is also planning to deploy 4 warplanes to the region. NATO members, the United States, France, and Britain, have already sent fighter aircraft and AWACS to Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia in response to what they call Russia's aggression. NATO has increased its military presence near the borders of Ukraine over the past 2 months. It has also sent warships to the Baltic Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, let's cross over and talk to our correspondent, Press TV's correspondent, Joshua Blackney in Calgary. Well, Joshua, tell us about this situation, that what has happened that Canada now has decided to send in 6 F-18 fighter jets.
Yes, well, ever since the fraudulent events of 9/11, Canada's governments have been intent upon intervening and reshaping various countries in pursuit of a neoconservative war on terror, an endless war against any country which poses a counter-hegemonic threat to the US-Israel unipolar world that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Canada's government is not a government of the Canadian people. It's a client regime of the US and Israel. And as such, when those governments decide that they are going to back a certain initiative, for example, backing the Putsch regime in Kiev in order to check Russian power, that Canada will go along with that. And so it's obviously, this runs against the interests of the ordinary people of Canada, who unfortunately have been brainwashed to believe that Canadians and the Canadian military only fight just wars, that the US military and NATO only fight just wars, when in reality there's Machiavellian power politics at play, and Canada's military is being used as a plaything yet again in pursuit of this, what some have referred to as a new world order, attempting to prevent a counter-hegemon emerge to check US-Israeli power in the world.
Well, Joshua, what about the Canadians themselves? Do they not ask the question, why would they have to get involved in this situation right now? Why would their government even need to send these airplanes there now?
Unfortunately, the Canadian mainstream media is to a large extent run by fanatical Zionists who support the various destabilization efforts that are taking place in the world, because for the most part, they buttress Israeli hegemonic interests. For example, the destabilization of Syria, which Canada has been covertly backing, helps Israel. And so the Canadian media, for the most part, promotes that destabilization agenda and gives a very tendentious spin on it. And that's the same situation with Ukraine, where we've been given a very biased, one-sided interpretation of what's taking place in the Canadian media. The Ukrainians and the Ukrainian coup regime is being portrayed as the underdog, and Russia as the aggressor, when, you know, more honest and cooler heads, if they were prevailing, would conclude that the picture is far more complex and nuanced than that. And so the Canadian media gives a propagandistic pro-war interpretation of the various conflagrations that are taking place in the world, which leads many Canadians to be duped into supporting their taxpayer money being used to fund this US-Israeli New World Order style agenda.
Joshua, real quickly, we're just about out of time, but in general, are Canadians concerned that there is a new war on the horizon, which could be pretty horrific if we're talking about the powers of the United States and its allies and Russia? Is this being talked about at all?
No, it's not being talked about. Typically, whenever Canada makes military interventions, you know, it's not treated as a particularly egregious issue in the Canadian media. Obviously, you know, there have been examples in North America in the past, for example, when the US was bombing Vietnam, of the people rising up and saying, no, we oppose war. And so the media does its best to portray every military excursion as being benign and being about peacemaking. There's this kind of myth of Canada as the peacemaker, that Canada's a peacekeeper. in this country, and so people aren't really well informed of the implications of this provocative act, which would be analogous to Russia turning up with its military, for example, in Mexico or Alaska or in the United States. You know, if Russia was amassing its military on the Alaskan-Canadian border, that would be viewed as a provocation by the Canadian government and by Canadian people. And yet when Canada goes onto Russia's doorstep with its military in support of a NATO destabilization operation, that's viewed as being just normal and plausible and justifiable foreign policy for Canada to employ. Clearly, this runs against Canada's national interests. Unfortunately, the Canadian media is controlled by people who adopt a pro-war agenda.
Thank you so much for being with us. Press TV's Joshua Blakeney out of Calgary.